Good morning. Welcome back to Daybreak. It's now 23 minutes to 7 o'clock, and my name is Sam Gituku, just in time for the discussion on what's making headlines in different news outlets, as well as what's making public conversations in the country. And I want us to begin by looking at what's trending on the two dailies, starting with the front page of the Daily Nation. Inside the attorney's 3.02 trillion budget. Of course, last year, or the current financial year 2020-2021, we had a budget, or we have had a budget of 2.81 trillion shillings. It's just about to go higher by about 200 billion shillings to hit 3.02 trillion. And you will see how that national cake will be shared. The financing deficit is said to be requiring an external debt of 345 billion shillings, which is 2.8% of the GDP, and the net domestic borrowing should be 592.2 billion shillings. This is 4.7% of GDP, and if you have to look at it, then it will tell you that we require about 945 billion shillings from borrowing, because we will be having that revenue shortfall, and the details can be seen on page 4, 5, and 6 of the Daily Nation. You see that the Treasury CS projects that the government will have a revenue shortfall inclusive of grants of 937.6 billion shillings. That's a major story on the Daily Nation. On the front page of the Standard, there's a different sort of debt. It's not a financial debt, but a political debt. You owe me a debt. This is according to Raila Odinga, who is said that he's facing the mountain in a renewed charm offensive for President Uhuru's backyard. ODM leader Raila Odinga tells Region it owes him a big political debt accumulated over the last 57 years by Kenya's 3 presidents, and now it is time to repay, it seems. We'll come to that, but first, let's begin with that story of the budget. And I want to begin with you, Honorable Gladys Boss, because you look at it, and inside Uhuru's record 3 trillion shilling budget, the key numbers are 13 trillion is the projected economy size by July next year. This is on the front page of the Standard. 937 billion shillings is the amount Treasury plans to borrow in 2021-2022. KRA's revenue target for the next financial year is 1.7 trillion shillings, and the equitable share allocation to the counties is 343 billion shillings. I don't know what happened to the promise that was with the new formula, the Senate, but what comes to your mind when you're reading these numbers? Of course, it will be the final full-year budget for President Kenyatta's administration, or for President Kenyatta. What do you think?
Okay, I'm a little surprised, because I remember that sometime in 2019, Ukuru Yatiani came before the Committee on Delegated Legislation, requesting to raise the debt ceiling to 9 trillion shillings. His argument was that he wanted Kenya to have better creditworthiness so they can borrow internationally and not borrow locally, so that they would phase out domestic borrowing. So he promised us that he was going to retire all domestic borrowing, which is at 9%. International borrowing is at 1%. And on that basis...
That is the interest rate?
The interest rate, yes. And then also it would free up money for small, medium enterprises to be able to borrow from the local banks. Because you see, if they're lending money to the bank, to the government, then they don't need to lend money to ordinary people. And he was so convincing, and all members of parliament agreed to increase the debt ceiling to 9 trillion, just to allow him to be able to retire international loans. But I still see it showing up in his budget.
So at the moment, I'm just trying to get the figures according to
I think he's got domestic loans.
No, I'm saying I'm trying to get the figures from the central bank in as far as where the debt is. I'll be giving you that number already, but from the political
circles... At that time,
I
think it was 5.7 trillion.
Yeah.
During the time when he asked for the 9 trillion ceiling.
All right, and of course, so far the political class has been saying that the debt may have gone way above 7 trillion shillings or into 8 trillion shillings. And also we have on the line Wanjiru Gikonyo from TISA and Senator Sylvia Kasanga. Let me begin with you, Wanjiru. So when you read the papers and say, yes, we're going to have a 3.02 trillion budget, but then again, nearly a third of that we'll have to borrow, whether domestically or externally, to finance it. What have we come to as a country that over the past 8 or so years we have had this persistent borrowing, whether it's external or domestic, to really plug that hole in our budget?
Thank you, Sam, and a pleasure to be here, and deeply concerned because our budget has grown from 800 billion when the Jubilee administration was coming into 2.3 trillion last year, now growing to 3.2 trillion supposedly. And the question is, where is this money? Kenyans aren't feeling the money. Revenues are falling because to raise this money, government is overtaxing people. So number one, the size of the budget needs to be questioned by Parliament because it is driven by expenditure that is not delivering. And in fact, there's a lot of corruption because if you're spending 2.3 trillion and Kenyans can't feel it, then the question is, where is that money? Then the second question, because if you create a budget based on a revenue of 1.7 trillion, and you're saying we don't have half this money, we're going to have to borrow it, at a time when you're already repaying debt to the tune of 900 billion. So already about 1 trillion of our budget is debt repayment. That amount cannot be refinanced in one financial year. Actually, we need a plan to reduce our debt dependency, whether domestic or international. We need another plan to get rid of the corruption projects that are driving this. So what the minister has done actually is, and we can hear from Honorable Boss Soleil, that they are lying to Parliament, and we need to ask the question, in terms of oversight, Parliament needs to exercise its powers. They're also lying to the public because what we were told is that they are going to curb expenditure. They are going to curb the points of expenditure so that they can reduce the budget deficit. Deficit financing creates debt. It can only be sustainable when your projects are sustainable. Unfortunately, where they have put the money, those projects like the SGR are overfinanced, there's a lot of corruption, not sustainable, short-term borrowing instead of long. So there are a number of things here. There is lies by the ministry. There is budgeted corruption, which is still driving expenditure. And there's also lies to Parliament and the people of Kenya. So I am shocked, dismayed, and I think we need to get together with Parliament, get the people of Kenya to say, hold on a minute, stop it. We cannot afford to grow the deficit at a time when we should be reducing the deficit by curbing non-essential expenditure.
Non-essential expenditure. Of course, many times we've heard of austerity measures. They don't know what success rate we have. But in November 2020, this is according to the Central Bank of Kenya, the official figures on the public debt. As of November 2020, the public debt was at 7.2 trillion shillings, that comprising 3.7 trillion from external market and 3.4 billion domestically, or rather 3.4 trillion domestically. Of course, the political class has different figures because I've had a figure of more than 8 trillion shillings. But Senator Kasanga, I'm looking at all the numbers and how the national cake, or is it national? Let's just say national, but the components of that are both foreign and domestic. But when you look at it, the counties said that they will receive 343 billion shillings. I remember at that time there was heated conversation at the Senate over the formula, and some money was allocated so as to make the formula not to hurt counties that have historically received higher amounts. Are you convinced that this is going to cure the problem and is going to yield to achieving the priorities for counties who continue to complain of delays in exchequer releases?
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much, viewers and listeners. Thank you for having me this morning. I really appreciate it. And Sam, I have to say that I've just seen, of course, this as you have shared it with us. So this is something that I have personally not studied, and I know we shall get a lot more information and detail in Parliament so that we can interrogate it in depth. But from the word go, of course, what is being allocated to the counties is not what was negotiated. As you will remember, how fiery it was in Parliament when senators came out full force to make sure that counties receive, something that is at least reasonable and that counties were not losing. So that I don't see that figure on these numbers that are here in the newspaper. And for me, that is actually very worrying. And like rightfully, as Madam Wanjiru has said, I would have expected that at this point in time, with all the debt that the country has, I'd have been happy to see some methodology of curbing expenditure here. I was not expecting to see this size of budget and spending again this year, when we know very well things are really, really tough. And I have to say something. I was on a different platform and listening one time in another platform where, you know, the issue of budgeted corruption came up, because the question is, every time budget ceilings have been increased thanks to Parliament, and I really do blame Parliament heavily for this, there's been not enough interrogation as to what is happening to the current loans. And this is a fact. And, you know, my friend, Honorable Chalet, and I have to say good morning to you, you're in the Delegated Legislation Committee. You know, this question has come up. How is it that, you know, the CS can come to Parliament and say, let's increase, you know, the debt ceiling, and we promise that we shall do 1, 2, 3. How about interrogating what the previous loans have been doing? And this is where really the gap now is. At this point in time, we should be seeing austerity measures. We should be seeing government cutting expenditure very heavily. And we should be seeing, in some cases, like the judiciary, we should be seeing a higher budget for judiciary, because we are trying to fight corruption. I mean, this is how a government should be telling us. These are now the key steps that we are taking in the next, you know, 1 year. We want to fight corruption.
Right.
We want to make sure we can, you know, retrieve some of the lost money through corruption and put it back, you know, into development projects. But, you know, from a nutshell, and from what I'm just seeing now from this picture, definitely a lot leaves to be desired, Sam. And I will be looking forward to interrogate it a little bit more. And of course, you know, with the counties, I mean, what is 1.9 trillion still doing at executive? And no wonder there's all this, you know, politics now around us, because that budget is too big to be at the executive. We need more money to go actually to the counties, because the devolved functions, you know, are the biggest functions that are serving Kenyans. So we need a lot more money now going to the counties. But be that as it may, at least what was promised last year must be delivered. And when it comes to the issue of, you know, the treasury, releasing money in such piecemeal, such that counties are not able to, you know, effectively budget and utilize their funds, that is already a very outstanding, thorny issue in this country. And I don't know what the CS is going to tell us that is going to change, you know, this year, as we know they're already running far behind, you know, with the monies, you know, for this financial year. So, I mean, we're looking forward to hearing a lot more from the CS.
Okay, all right. Of course, as you say, the Exchequer releases, some of the explanation you've been given is the challenges with revenue collection. I was just looking up the numbers that during the negotiation of the new formula, it was promised that in the next financial year, which begins July this year, the county should receive a combined total of 370 billion shillings. But from the estimates here, we are seeing about, or rather the policy statement, it appears that the counties will be receiving 343 billion shillings. So I've wanted Honorable Alice Wahome to join in on this conversation, but you'll allow her to settle down. But still on the same note, so when you look at all this financial management of these resources at the National Treasury, Honorable Alice Wahome, we are talking about the budget preparations for the next financial year, which begins in July, that is the 1st of July. We are seeing 3.02 trillion budget, but as you look at it, 1.92 trillion shillings will remain at the national executive, and then you have the counties will be receiving, there are two figures. The Daily Nation talks over 326 billion shillings, but the Standard talks about 343 billion shillings as the equitable share allocation for counties. But the promise had been 370 billion shillings at the negotiation of the new formula. But the question I would want to raise with you, with Senator Kasanga saying that 1.92 trillion shillings is too much to remain at the national level, would that make a case of devolving more funds to the tune of 35% as contained in the BBI document?
I really don't know what is in the BBI document so far, because, and we cannot be able to have a sensible debate from a document that is not yet legal. And thank you very much for having me this morning, Sam. But I will say that, and I say that with a lot of respect to the work that has been put in the BBI. So far, you know, it hasn't passed. There is not no legislation yet. The budget and appropriation work in Parliament continues. And in fact, this particular session of Parliament will be a busy session. The government quarter now, starting from January all the way to March, they are already very busy preparing the budget. 1.9 trillion being a lot for the national government. You see, right now, assuming that we don't even have any constitutional amendment done, there is nothing that stops the government from sending money to the counties, because you know the current constitution clearly gives us the minimum of 15%. So assuming we have this basket of the money that we are talking about on page 1 of the nation, then we can be able to transfer sufficient money to the counties. But again, the money to be transferred to the counties is not a blanket just transfer. We need to complete the costing of functions that have been devolved to the counties, and also hold the counties accountable. I think there is a lot that we have been talking about transferring of the money. It is time that the conversation now be redirected to look at how we are spending that money. But of course, because we are talking about budgeting,
right,
do we even have the 3.2 trillion? I have listened to some of the conversations that you held before I came in. There is a deficit, and we all know that. The amount of money that the country is putting together is about maybe not more than 2 trillion. It's about maybe 1.8. So there is a big deficit that is met by the borrowing, both internally and externally. And I think the question also was why, you know, how are we allowing this borrowing?
Right.
So Sylvia, I listened to my colleague Sylvia saying that we need to be able to send more. I think even the national government needs to explain clearly the amount of money, and that should be done by Parliament. I agree that Parliament needs to be more stringent, more clear in its work.
Right.
But you know, Parliament gets guided a lot by the National Treasury, and there is a way that we are not doing it correctly. I want to agree. There is a way we are not doing it correctly. We seem to be adopting maybe just templates from the National Treasury, and even the borrowing levels. We have kept on being persuaded by the National Treasury, but I am not convinced that the spending is being done correctly, and especially the borrowing part.
Okay.
The internal borrowing has been the biggest challenge, because the cost of the money is quite high compared to external borrowing. And the cost, the last time the CS appeared before the delegated committee, and Gladys that time, before she was removed from her position as the chair of delegated legislation, not because of incompetence, of course, because of politics. The CS persuaded the committee that he needed an extra borrowing, but it was specifically to help him restructure the internal loans that were costing the country heavily, between 9 and 11%. And we had agreed that we will maybe work with the finance committee to demand, finance and also budget committee to demand a listing, you know, an inventory of the loans and where they are, so that we can interrogate whether then the money we will be borrowing externally, because externally we were going to maybe be charged, I think, 1%. About 1%, which was, you know, a considerable drop from 10%. So we are yet to do that. And I think we need to demand and hold the government accountable to bring the loans that we have borrowed externally, and who is lending to the government, because also that lending in the government then makes the market very small for the local investment and business people. And I think there is a monkey business, some there happening, because the people who are encouraging, or the people who are lending to the government also, there is a lot of conflict of interest, are also running the government. Some of them are running the government, and I think we are kind of like stealing from the country through that borrowing.
Who are these?
In a way, because, and who are these? I know that that's the question. I think that will maybe be a debate for another day when we ask for this list.
No, I think what
yeah.
Sam should do
Yeah.
is you should be demanding, as the media, as we demand in Parliament, that we want to know which are these
Who are
local
these?
banks
Yes.
that have
And
been
the
lending to
ownership.
government and
Okay.
who owns these local banks.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
that is where,
That's an assignment for
yes, that's
the
an
media
assignment for
as
the
well
media.
as-
For most
It's
as
media
well as
and
Parliament.
Parliament.
Yes,
Let-
Parliament were, and I was going to ask in my committee. Unfortunately, I was removed from the committee, and all of us who are going to ask questions were removed from the committee. So we are not in a position, but we are still going to demand on the floor of the House.
Okay.
We are also going to put pressure on our colleagues
Okay.
that we want to know how much is the domestic borrowing currently and from which banks.
And let me take it back to Wanjiru from TSA, because when you look at when President Kenyatta was coming into office, at that time, the total public debt was at 1.79 trillion shillings. Now, the official figures, I'm relying on the official figures, put it at 7.2 trillion shillings. So that's an increment of more than 5 trillion. So just to break it down, the external debt that Kibaki bequeathed the country was 812 billion shillings. That's the external debt. Now it's 3.7 trillion. The domestic debt that time was 981 billion shillings. It's now 3.48 trillion shillings. And I know you said you spoke about corruption, embezzlement of funds and what have you. Do you think Kenyans have really done their job in demanding for answers or demanding answers when these numbers have been rising this exponentially? When you look at the impact on the economy, do you see this? Because most of this has been taken to coming up with the infrastructure. Do you think it has been of benefit to Kenyans and their socio-economic lives?
Core Uchumi Coalition, which I hope we are continually trying to enlist more, public leaders to join us in this campaign. We are very clear. The problem with debt is the deficit financing. It's the budget deficit. And the driver of the budget deficit is the national flagship, the presidential flagship projects. And it's the lack of transparency around those projects. And, in very simple terms, we have huge infrastructure projects that money has been borrowed then on very unfavorable terms for some of them. Many of those projects are then not productive, so they're not paying back the money. So whereas we support the government's effort, the Treasury's efforts to refinance this project, to restructure debt, the problem, and whereas we also support the Treasury's plan to institute a COVID response, because, if you look at the economic recovery strategy published late last year by the Treasury, they are talking about some quite a sizable amount, about, I believe it was around 600 billion going to the COVID response, which is to cushion industry and Kenyans who've been negatively affected by debt. We support this. The problem is the lack of transparency. We saw a debt register published that doesn't have enough details, like Honorable Wahome is saying. You don't have a clear sense of where is the money going, who are the underwriters, because the people who advance the debt and also secure the debt also have interests. And when they have interests, you can actually have a borrowing that is more than the need, so that we are borrowing to actually pay people. The IMF actually, in terms of the restructuring program and the relief program that is ongoing, have said they want an independent and comprehensive audit of the debt of all Kenya's debts. At present, the Treasury has not published the loan information beyond 2018. So you wonder, how are we preparing a budget when the Treasury has not complied with the basic constitutional requirement for transparency around the loans? Beginning of last year, the Budget and Appropriations Committee demanded this information be published. When the Treasury published, they published up to 2018. They haven't published 2019. They haven't published the recent loans. So how is Treasury operating if they have this information? We must conclude Treasury does not want to reveal the information around loans. And I totally agree, and I think you are asking, have Kenyans done enough? Kenyans have done their part. When SGR borrowing, Eurobond borrowing was going on, there were very many public discussions, even court actions, to try and stop what was obviously a corruption scheme. We are not saying SGR is bad. We are not saying borrowing is bad. But when there is no transparency around the contracting around the borrowing, when you see prices inflated 3-4 times in the course of the negotiations, you know things aren't right. So the point is, Parliament, and you know, with all respect to the honorable members here, you have the power. The oversight is in you. Citizens can complain. Citizens actually have gone to court. What has Parliament done? Unfortunately, this tyranny of numbers and then the handshake have denied Kenyans the oversight accountability. And if Parliament, these parliamentarians are going to be answerable to the people, the one thing they need to do is curb, you know, get on top of this issue. Our call actually was, you know, we feel that the debt crisis actually is so bad. You can see that institutions of higher learning, you can see the medical profession, health workers, you can see the social discontent, and all around, it's all around payment.
Right.
You can see that COVID has hit agriculture and health. These are devolved functions. How do you then not put money where the problem is? So there is a big expenditure loophole.
Okay.
And there's also a revenue loophole, and this loophole is the lack of oversight by Parliament. We need to hold this government to account. This money is being geared towards campaigns. It's geared towards the BBI.
How do you know that?
Towards elections. We can surmise. We can surmise that the budgeted corruption now is being driven by some of these political expediencies. Because looking at the past record, there is budgeted corruption. This is on record. The AG also recognized that. Even the president himself said we are bleeding 2 billion a day. So we need to get to the bottom of this, because this is what is driving debt, and the Kenyans are the ones left bearing the tax burden. So we must
all right,
remember
Wanjiru.
that Kenyans will pay for this. Thank
All
you.
right, let me take you to Senator Kasanga, because you've been in Parliament as a nominated senator, and for the 3 years or so that you've been there, is that allegation that the tyranny of numbers, with the tyranny of numbers, you can never get any contrary voice passing through? Have you felt it, and how difficult has it been, especially putting the government to account? I know you sit at the Senate, not exactly the National Assembly, but from your experience, how exactly difficult has it been?
You know, Sam, just borrowing from Honorable Wahome, she has just mentioned a word, persuasion. And she says that the CS of Treasury comes to persuade Parliament to okay certain things. When certain constitutional requirements by the CS have not been met when it comes to issues of transparency, as Wanjiru is saying, then you know we have a problem. And this is something that is in the public view, and members of Parliament who sit in those various committees must take responsibility for having brought the country to this level. And that is a fact, Sam. And let's not say anything about handshake, or when the handshake came, this is when it happened. The last time the CS was in Parliament, in National Assembly, seeking for adjustment of the debt ceiling, all these members of Parliament were sitting the way they were when we went, you know, first into Parliament. Before the handshake. So everyone has to take responsibility for their part. The fact that Parliament has every instrument. They have the power, as Wanjiru said, they have the instruments to interrogate the executive. They have the power to demand that the executive follows the constitution to the letter. I know, and you know, like I said, we had this conversation on a different platform where a member of Parliament in the Finance Committee owned up and said, very rightfully, that they have demanded severally that the CS of Treasury set up a debt office in his department, so that they are able to interrogate how these monies are moving around, like what Wanjiru is saying, who is lending, you know, from the local, you know, the local lenders, who are the local lenders, who are the international lenders, how is money actually, you know, debt money, how is it actually being distributed and used? And to this day, he said that that has not happened. So the question is, how then do members of Parliament allow themselves to be persuaded? And this issue of persuasion is the problem. And we know what happens in the corridors of Parliament. That is a fact. We know how this persuasion happens.
I don't know. Tell me, what happens?
Yes, we know. We've seen these things happening in the corridors of Parliament, these persuasion things. And you know, that member of Parliament said it openly on our national platform. exactly what has happened. And the question now is,
Okay,
and this is now
wait a
when-
minute, Senator
when we have
Kasanga.
to come out-
I thought when you said
Sorry,
persuasion, I was just taking it as an English term persuasion.
I think let me correct
What exactly
that,
do you
sir.
I
mean?
think I need to
'Cause the-
correct
'cause
because I'm the one who used the word.
Yes,
Some
but
persuasion-
yes,
Just a moment.
I can assure you, persuasion is not just the CS coming and pleading, oh please. That is a fact, that is known. I don't even have to say it in black and white.
No, you need
But
to
Sam,
say
the
it. I
fact
don't know
remains-
it.
Yes, Sam, but the fact remains, the issue that Parliament is allowing itself to be persuaded as opposed to them doing their constitutional mandate of oversight and demanding is the reason why we find ourselves in this situation, Sam. And this is the thing that Kenyans have to come to terms with, and they must understand that they have to hold their members of Parliament to account. In fact, to a point where we would like to see who voted for the increase of the debt ceiling, because we know they didn't have enough information. We know they didn't demand
Senator
for the CS to
Kasanga.
do as much as could have done. We want to know who these people are.
Senator
this
Kasanga,
is
if
now
you can
how
hear me,
it's
I'm
set
sure you
up.
can.
And
I'm just reading, persuasion means convincing others to change their point of view, agree to a commitment. What exactly do you mean? How is persuasion done at Parliament?
I think you should allow us to
Maybe we'll
respond to
hear
her.
from
Yes, I will.
National Assembly members who are present today, how they have been persuaded before. But
Okay.
the fact remains, a lot happens in the corridors of Parliament, and Kenyans know that. It has been in the public view and in the public realm. And we need to agree that these are the issues and the challenges that have
Okay.
have caused us to be in this situation. And some have said on this platform, and I've said it before, we cannot go into another election cycle with Parliament the way it is. I personally would love to see a very robust opposition in Parliament, so that Parliament now can check itself as well as check the executive and do what needs to be done.
Okay.
The way it is now, it's easy for the executive to persuade Parliament, as you have seen. The executive has such a big hold on Parliament, and therefore manages to get its way.
Okay.
And that has to change.
All right, Senator. Honorable Boss, what is this persuasion that Senator Kasanga is talking about?
I think I take great exception to the insinuation by Senator Kasango. I think she's almost implying that there was some form of corruption for that decision to be made by the members of the delegated committee. I chaired the Committee on Delegated Legislation. Honorable Wahome here was also one of the members. And I think the Committee on Delegated Legislation under my leadership was ranked as the best performing committee. There has been no committee that has been more diligent and churned out more reports than any other committee in the history of Parliament. So, and this was very clear. In fact, it's available for the public to see, is the PowerPoint presentation that was made by Ukuri Yatiani. And what he told us is that we are borrowing domestically, and it is costing us 9 to almost 11% in interest. He then said, we would like to retire all domestic loans and only borrow internationally, which will cost us 1%. Which Kenyan who is responsible would not accept that kind of decision? And at that time, in order for them to borrow internationally, they then required to improve their credit rating. For the country to improve its credit rating, then we had to actually pass the regulations that allowed our debt ceiling from, I think it was 7 trillion to 9 trillion. Not because they were going to borrow to 9 trillion at that time. He told us it was only to give them better credit rating so that they can borrow internationally. And I remember clearly, and if anybody goes to the reports of the committee, we said to him, because at that time, if we had not allowed it, what we were explained to is that the country was coming to a shutdown. Wasn't that what we were told by it's in the Hansard. That is exactly what the minister said to us. So we said, we will allow you to increase the debt ceiling to 9 trillion, retire all domestic loans, and he agreed that he would come back to the committee. In fact, we gave him 3 months to report back to the committee and come and tell us exactly how much has been retired, from which months, all the details. Unfortunately, what happened, many of us were kicked out of the committee, and they put people in the committee and to chair the committee, persons who were more acceptable to the system. Currently, the KANU member of parliament, Kamket Kasait, is the one who's the chairperson, of the Committee on Delegated Legislation.
Right.
So the questions we should be asking, and what Senator Kasango should be asking, is has Ukur Yatiani appeared before the committee? I may not be able to ask it in the committee because I don't sit in all those committees anymore, but I will be asking on the floor of the House. Now that this has come out, I then will ask on the floor of the House that we need, the minister actually is the one who should be asked very specific details. Or else when they tell us that 2 billion shillings is being lost to corruption daily. In 2013, I remember the collections by government was 2 billion daily. So are you saying we are losing all our taxes almost to corruption? Maybe then part of the corruption is this continued, and I'm still seeing here that they are still borrowing domestic. That shouldn't have been showing after what he told us before the committee, and I'm taking on the CS, the National Treasury. I want you to appear before the committee and explain to Kenyans why we are still borrowing domestic loans when you promised us, and it is in the Hansard, and you should be held to account, then maybe that's the corruption money we are talking about.
All right, Alice Ome, I want us to take a break, but before we do, there's a claim that was made by Senator Kasanga that there's some sort of persuasion. I was actually convinced that it's just how you can persuade someone to...
Sam,
does that happen?
First and foremost, I agree. I take great exception to her illusion or her accusation that the committee or parliament gets compromised. In specific reference to this particular work, I think Senator Sylvia is being reckless and insultive. We did not come to the national platform here to trade politics. I think we are discussing a very serious matter, and for her to translate the term persuasion as corruption, I think that is extremely wrong, and she needs to apologize to us. But this is the point, Sam. When I use the word persuasion, Parliament is a house of debate, both at committee level and even on the floor. During the committee, you have more time to discuss, to even debate among the members, to exchange ideas and analyze presentations and documentation. And there is also legal advice within the committee. And as Grade said, we moved out even from the committee to have a bigger platform where the CS himself personally appeared because the committee was reluctant and said they are not going to allow extra borrowing. At that time, I think the borrowing was standing at about 5.8 trillion, and he told us he needed to move it to have a margin of maximum 9 trillion from 5.8. So, and the room for that margin was not for immediate borrowing. That was not for 2020. It was to run up to 2024. And therefore, I do not expect, and these are the other things that we can do as Parliament. How much then has he managed to borrow within that margin, and how has that been used? And therefore, Sylvia, even at their level, sometimes they are erratic. Sometimes the Senate doesn't know its mandate. And I say that with great respect because there are many things that they ought to also have done and they have not been able to do. So in this particular case, we did our work like Grades has explained, and I personally, and the Hansard again will bear witness that I asked him, I would like to see the list because he did not present us with the list, although the work of clear interrogation, delegated mandate, committee's mandate is slightly different because within the statutory instrument, that actually is asking like the list and whatever is outside our mandate. It is the work of the budget and appropriation that should interrogate those specific details. And before he comes to formulating regulation, he ought to have by then certified the budget. And that's why you see they were even given timeline and given specific conditions. And therefore, to that extent, I would say that Parliament, on this particular case, on the case of debts, has really agonized. And we were almost saying no. But the word persuasion then, therefore, means he put material before the committee, material that was evidential and was sufficient to tell us, look, we have a duty as members of Parliament to assist the government
Rescue the country,
to deal with the country's situation.
All right.
Therefore, there's nothing to do with corruption. If in Senate, because by the way, you know, there is also a lot of talk that Senate keeps on getting compromised, especially where they are unable to hold governors to account. Maybe that talk is within the Senate. I am not aware within my committee. It may happen in other committees, but in our committee, and I really don't want to make any unfounded accusation.
All right.
But in our committee, it did not happen. It has not happened.
All right, Honorable Alice Wahome,
Yeah,
of course,
and
we're
she
still
needs
with
to take back that.
We're still with the Honorable Gladys Boss and Senator Sylvia Kasanga and Wanjiru Gikonyo. We take a short break, but when we return, we continue the conversation. We're looking at the road to 2022. Of course, there's so many messages that we're hearing, political messages. There's the conversation around Hustler versus Dynasty. There's also talk of debt, not public debt, but political debt that Raila Odinga is talking about. There's also the debt that early on in the current term we had that Uhuru Kenyatta and his supporters owed William Ruto a debt. We'll be talking about that, whether really what is in the public discourse is what should really matter, or we're just politicking 18 months to the election. After the break.